Rain swept across the rolling fields as the country inn came into view. An old timbered house crouched beneath a stand of dark pines, its windows glowing like watchful eyes in the gloom. The Silent Heart, as the sign proclaimed, had hosted travelers for 2 centuries without ever attracting more than passing notice. But tonight it would become the setting of a crime so maddeningly impossible that even the most seasoned constable would be left scratching his head, and only one mind, sharp, patient, and intolerant of nonsense, could hope to untangle it. The storm had driven most guests indoors hours earlier, but the innkeeper, Mrs. Martha Welford, insisted she heard someone outside just after midnight. She described it later as a single heavy footstep on the gravel path, followed by silence so complete it made her skin crawl. Assuming it was one of her guests returning from the stables, she went back to polishing cutlery, but unease lingered like a draft under a closed door. That unease swelled to full alarm when a scream tore through the house. A sharp, terrified cry from the east wing, where the wealthiest guest, Mr. Leonard Brixton, lodged. By the time she reached his door with the night porter, breathless and trembling, the scream had already dissolved into stillness. They knocked. No answer. They called his name. Nothing. The door was locked from the inside. It took the porter 3 strikes with his shoulder to break it open. What they found inside would trouble the sleepy village of Hemsley-on-Roe for years. Leonard Brixton, industrialist, art collector, and occasional donor to whichever cause flattered him most, lay collapsed beside the writing desk, his face chalk white and his eyes wide, fixed on something no ordinary gaze could see. No wound, no blood, no sign of poison in the air, just a man dead without a mark on him. The only oddity was a small square of paper lying inches from his outstretched fingers, its center bearing a single perfect circle drawn in blue ink. No words, no signature, no explanation. The window was latched, the fireplace cold, the rug undisturbed. A locked room death, plain as daylight. And yet nothing about it felt plain at all. Mrs. Welford sent the porter racing to fetch the constable at once. By dawn, the local authorities had inspected every inch of the room. They found no hidden passages, no tampering with the lock, no evidence of anyone entering or leaving. The paper with the circle was bagged as evidence, though none could say what it meant. A child's doodle, a warning, a signature. It was all too absurd. This was the sort of mystery that would normally send police into weeks of tedious squabbles and dead ends. But fate, or perhaps frustration, brought Inspector Harriet Vale to the Silent Heart before the second pot of morning tea had finished steeping. Harriet was known in the region as the sort of detective who never accepted the difference between the impossible and the merely unexamined. She strode into the inn with a no-nonsense air, raindrops still glittering in her coat, and asked for every detail from the moment Brixton checked in 2 nights prior. Guests whispered her name like an incantation. Harriet Vale, the one who'd solved the Whitmarsh disappearance using nothing but a misplaced railway ticket. Harriet Vale, who uncovered the poisoner at Greenwillow despite every villager swearing she was chasing shadows. If anyone could make sense of a dead man in a locked room clutching a mysterious circle, it was her. She began with the body. The doctor had already performed a cursory examination and declared the death unaccountable but likely cardiac in nature. Harriet inspected Brixton's hands, clean, no defensive marks. His posture collapsed but not violently so. His expression fearful, yes, but not contorted. His clothing untouched save for a small fleck of something pale on his cuff. She scraped it gently with a gloved fingernail and stored the sample. Dust, perhaps, or paint, or something more unusually placed. Her attention then shifted to the room. She observed slowly, methodically, the faint scent of lavender polish on the desk, the slight unevenness in the rug's weave near the hearth, the window's latch, secure but a little loose from years of use. Not a single footprint, but Brixton's disturbed the thin layer of dust beneath the radiator, leading her to tap the metal thoughtfully. Nothing unusual inside. When she finally examined the paper with the blue circle, she held it up to the light, as if expecting it to reveal its purpose. "A circle without context is rarely meaningless," she murmured. "People seldom die holding random geometry." In the corridor, she questioned each guest. A traveling bookseller who swore he slept through everything. a honeymooning couple who heard the scream but were too frightened to leave their room, a retired schoolmistress who claimed she saw a shadow in the courtyard around midnight, but insisted it was probably a branch swaying in the wind. Harriet listened carefully, noting tone, hesitation, and detail. She asked not only what they heard, but what they didn't hear: the absence of footsteps, the absence of argument, the absence of any known motive. Everyone agreed Brixton kept to himself, emerging only for supper the night before the incident, where he ate briskly, spoke to no one, and returned to his room with the air of a man eager to avoid attention. But Harriet did not believe in quiet men without purpose. She asked Mrs. Welford for Brixton's luggage. Inside were neatly folded suits, a toiletries bag, and a leather-bound notebook locked with a clasp. No key. She shook it gently. Something inside shifted. Maybe papers, maybe more. Harriet set it aside for later. The most troubling discovery came from the porter, who remembered the ink circle on the paper being a perfect blue, exactly the shade used by the inn's writing room. That ink was kept in a communal bottle with several pens available to any guest, meaning the mysterious circle could have been drawn by anyone staying at the Silent Heart. And given how perfect a circle it was, Harriet suspected a compass might have been used. Yet when she asked the guests whether any of them carried a drawing compass, each denied it. The bookseller laughed. The honeymooning husband shrugged. The schoolmistress blinked indignantly, insisting she hadn't taught geometry in ages, so who had drawn it? Harriet walked the perimeter of the inn grounds, her boots sinking in mud. She studied the gravel path for prints. Only one fresh track stood out, a single partial imprint near the east wing, heavy deep and pointing toward the forest. Just one step, as Mrs. Welford had heard. Then no others. It was as though someone had stepped into existence and promptly vanished. Rain had washed most of the detail away, but the weight of whoever made it was unmistakable. She stared into the woods, listening, nothing but distant crows. Returning inside, she reviewed the timeline. Brixton alive at supper, retired to his room, a single scream, a door locked from the inside. A dead man, unmarked, a blue circle, a solitary footprint, and no one admitting to hearing or seeing anything of value. But Harriet Vale believed that even silence was a witness, if one knew how to interrogate it. She ordered a fresh pot of tea and sat at the writing desk in Brixton's room, the place where he had spent his final moments. She aligned the chair, the paper, the pen. She imagined him writing, thinking, pausing. She tried to see what he saw. Her eyes drifted once more to the faint dust on his cuff, the pale fleck. She glanced at the mantel. She rose. The hearth was cold, but above it hung a framed pastoral painting. She leaned in until her nose was inches from the canvas. There, barely visible in the corner, was a tiny patch where the paint had been scraped away, exposing raw canvas beneath. A small circle shape had been etched lightly into it. Her eyes widened. Brixton had been trying to tell them something. The circle was no random doodle. It was a warning, a mark, a message. And it pointed not at the paper, but at the painting. She removed the frame from the wall. On the back, tucked between the wood and canvas, something shifted. Something thin, something deliberate. Harriet's pulse quickened. The crime was no longer unsolvable. It had only just begun to speak. Harriet's fingers grazed the narrow strip of paper hidden behind the canvas. Carefully she extracted it, noting that it had been folded multiple times, edges softened by handling. Unfolded, it revealed a short string of numbers and letters written in a spidery hand. E12Q7L5. To anyone else, it might have seemed like nonsense, a cipher or random cataloguing. But Harriet knew better. People rarely wrote such things without purpose. She slipped it into her notebook and returned the frame to its place, leaving everything outwardly undisturbed. The room, to the casual observer, remained a locked-room mystery, but Harriet's mind was already threading invisible connections. The inn had begun to hum with activity. Constables moved with measured slowness, cataloguing belongings, dusting for fingerprints, and taking statements from each guest. Harriet watched from a corner, quiet and unassuming, letting the uniformed men reveal the world through their own eyes. It was then that she noticed the young chambermaid, a pale girl named Eliza, hovering near the foot of the stairs. Her hands twisted the edge of her apron, her eyes flitting repeatedly toward the east wing. When Harriet met her gaze, the girl stiffened and swallowed hard, her posture suddenly rigid. "Miss Eliza," Harriet said softly, leaning closer as the girl approached, "you were here when Mr. Brixton died." "Yes, ma'am," the girl stammered, her voice barely audible over the creak of the stair treads. I heard the scream. I ran, but I didn't touch anything." "Of course," Harriet murmured, her tone calm yet probing. She didn't need the girl to speak the whole truth yet. Small reactions often told more than confessions. She observed the flush in her cheeks, the rapid blink of her eyes, the slight tremor in her fingers. Something in that subtle, nervous energy hinted at a story untold. Harriet made a mental note. This was the first thread to tug. Returning her attention to the room, Harriet moved methodically from desk to chair, from rug to window. The hearth remained cold, the rug unwrinkled save for the tiny dust disturbance she had noted earlier. Then her gaze fell on an ink blot on the blotter pad beside the writing desk. It was faint, nearly invisible unless one looked closely, but its shape, a small curved smudge, suggested something deliberate, almost like the tip of a compass had pressed briefly before being lifted. A curious detail, seemingly trivial, yet consistent with the single circle on the paper. She photographed it for evidence, knowing instinctively that the circle was no idle mark. Harriet stepped into the hallway, examining the door's brass handle. She noted a faint streak along the polished surface, a tiny smudge that did not match the fingerprints already recorded. Leaning closer, she realized it was not dirt, but a faint trace of lavender oil, the same scent lingering on Mrs. Welford's hands, but too strong to be coincidental. Someone had used the handle recently, deliberately or inadvertently, leaving a mark that would otherwise escape notice. This small detail, unnoticed by the constables, hinted at a presence that had escaped formal attention. Her eyes then caught the edge of a chair near the fireplace. Something about its placement struck her as odd. It had been nudged slightly, as if someone had leaned on it and left hurriedly. Harriet knelt, brushing away the thin layer of dust, and discovered a tiny scrap of thread, pale blue in color. Not from Brixton's attire, but perhaps from someone else's coat or scarf. She bagged it carefully, adding it to her growing collection of anomalies. The faint lavender trace, the smudge of ink, the cryptic note behind the painting, and now this thread. Individually, these might seem inconsequential. Together, they were the beginnings of a map. Harriet returned to the dining room, where the guests had been reconvened under the polite supervision of Mrs. Welford. She studied them with the patient intensity of someone noting every involuntary twitch, every glance, every hesitation. The bookseller, Mr. Pritchard, seemed overly interested in the unfolding investigation, leaning forward in his chair each time a new discovery was mentioned. The honeymooners whispered among themselves, glancing at the walls, as if the shadows might be hiding an intruder. The schoolmistress kept her gaze fixed on her hands, nails picking at the fabric of her sleeve. Harriet noted each reaction, not drawing immediate conclusions but filing them carefully in her mind. A sudden noise drew her attention to the fireplace. One of the constables had removed a log to check beneath the hearth. Harriet crouched beside him. There, partially concealed by soot and ash, lay a small brass key, no larger than a thimble. No one had claimed to see it before. It was polished but not new, and the design suggested it belonged to a lock of unusual specificity, perhaps a box, perhaps a cabinet, perhaps something more hidden. The key was curious, yes, but what caught Harriet's eye was the faint trace of blue ink along its edge. Someone had held it after marking the circle, or perhaps it had been used to secure the note's hiding place. Harriet's mind worked quietly, connecting invisible dots. The cryptic code, the small circle, the brass key, the thread, the lavender oil, the smudge of ink. They were all pieces of a puzzle that might explain not only the death, but the method behind it. She sensed the first signs of deception. Someone in the room, or in the inn, was not telling the whole truth. But who and why? She returned to Eliza, the chambermaid. "Tell me, did you notice anyone acting strangely last night? Anyone entering Mr. Brixton's room?" Eliza hesitated, then whispered, "I thought I saw someone near the east wing. Tall, wearing a coat. But it was so dark I couldn't be sure." "Was there anything peculiar about them?" Harriet asked gently. They had a faint smell, like flowers, lavender, and they carried something small, shiny, I think." Her voice faltered, but the detail was precise. Lavender, a small, shiny object. That could only refer to the key, Harriet realized, or something similar in size and weight. Harriet returned to the room once more. She traced the outline of the writing desk, noting the worn grooves and the tiny imperfections on its surface. Every groove, every dent, every scratch was a history of prior use. One in particular caught her attention, a faint indentation that matched the size of the brass key. Perhaps Brixton had been unlocking something in the desk just before his death. A sudden clarity struck Harriet. The circle, the note, the key, the hidden code, they were all connected to what Brixton had accessed, or attempted to access. The inn, once merely a setting, now seemed alive with secrets. Even the storm outside felt conspiratorial. The wind rattling window panes like a witness murmuring hints of the truth. Harriet studied the guests again, noting their movements, their interactions, their attempts to appear casual. Everyone was a potential observer or participant. And yet, one detail remained. None had mentioned seeing the key, the note, or the circle. Someone had been hiding not just objects, but knowledge, even from those closest at hand. As Harriet organized her notes, aligning anomalies with observations, she felt the first pulse of real progress. Routine procedures had uncovered the body, catalogued evidence, and secured the scene. But only her keen eye had noticed the subtleties, the blue ink smudge, the lavender trace, the misplaced thread, the brass key, the cryptic note, and the frightened glances of a girl who knew more than she admitted. The first layer of deception had revealed itself, delicate yet undeniable. Harriet's instincts told her that the deeper truth lay just beyond these surface irregularities. And for the first time since she arrived at the Silent Heart, Harriet Vale smiled faintly to herself. The crime was no longer an unsolvable puzzle. Its solution, like the inn's dimly flickering lamps, was within reach. But it required patience, observation, and a mind willing to read between the lines of the ordinary. She would wait, she would watch. And slowly, inexorably, the silent witnesses would speak. Harriet sat at a corner table in the inn's lounge, her notebook open but untouched for a moment as she observed the guests gathered there. Each had been asked to remain for questioning, though Mrs. Welford fussed about tea and biscuits, insisting that nervous stomachs required sustenance. Harriet welcomed the quiet clinking of cups. The ritual provided a rhythm against which lies often revealed themselves. She allowed the guests to settle, then spoke without preamble. "Mr. Pritchard," she said, her eyes steady on the bookseller, "you were present in the dining room at supper. Did you notice anyone behaving unusually? Anything out of place?" Pritchard adjusted his spectacles, leaning forward as though eager to impress. "Unusual? Not particularly, Inspector. Mr. Brixton was himself, of course, aloof as always. Though, now that I think of it, he seemed distracted, glancing repeatedly at the East Wing corridor. Perhaps he had business there." His hands fluttered as he spoke, betraying more than his words did. Harriet made a quiet note. Overeager to explain, over-cooperative, someone who volunteered details too readily, often had something to hide. Next came the honeymooners, Mr. and Mrs. Langley. They both swiveled in their chairs, shoulders brushing each other as though to form a single unit of truth. "We heard the scream," Mrs. Langley said. "It was awful. I couldn't imagine anyone could die so suddenly." Her voice trembled, and her husband added, "Yes, we went to the window but saw nothing. Absolutely nothing. We thought perhaps a guest had tripped or fallen, but there was no sign of it." Harriet noted the exact repetition of nothing in both statements. Too rehearsed, perhaps, or a mutual reassurance masking uncertainty. The schoolmistress, Miss Fenwick, was last. She sat upright, hands folded like armor across her lap. "I am afraid I do not understand what all the fuss is about," she said primly. "Mr. Brixton was a recluse. He kept to himself. A sudden death is unfortunate but hardly remarkable." Harriet observed the subtle tightening around her eyes, the faint twitch in her fingers. Dismissal often concealed knowledge. Harriet returned to Pritchard, curious about his repeated mentions of the East Wing. "You say Mr. Brixton looked toward that corridor several times. Did you see him approach the door, or handle anything?" Pritchard hesitated, then lowered his voice. I thought I saw him with a small envelope, but perhaps it was nothing. The candlelight was dim, and shadows played tricks. He avoided eye contact, his eagerness now tinged with uncertainty. Harriet made another note, a man willing to admit doubt only after being pressed, revealing potential deception. Turning to the Langleys, Harriet asked, "You heard the scream. Did you notice anyone else in the corridor or outside the room?" Mrs. Langley shifted uneasily. I thought I saw a figure leaving the East Wing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tall, perhaps someone in a dark coat." Her husband interjected hastily, "But it could have been the wind, or a trick of the storm." Their words collided awkwardly, betraying inconsistency. Harriet's keen eye caught the subtle contradiction, first a figure, then dismissal. Miss Fenwick, still tight-lipped, interjected, "I saw nothing." The storm made everything appear distorted. One might imagine shadows as people if one were inclined toward fancy. Her tone was sharp, defensive, almost rehearsed. Harriet filed it away. She had learned that the most principled personas often carried the heaviest secrets. She excused the others for a moment, asking Mrs. Welford to show her the East Wing corridor. The wood floors gleamed faintly under the morning light, yet Harriet noticed irregularities. One tile was slightly raised near the door to Brixton's room, a gap invisible to all but the observant eye. Her hand traced the edge, revealing a faint smudge of blue ink matching the circle. Someone had touched the floor, or dropped something while leaving the room. Returning to the lounge, Harriet questioned Eliza again. "Did anyone approach you last night, or ask questions you found odd?" The girl's eyes darted, her hands twisting. I think Mr. Pritchard lingered near the East Wing, looking at doors. I didn't say anything at the time." She swallowed hard, lips pressed together. Harriet's mind connected threads, the bookseller's eagerness, the girl's nervous recollection, the cryptic code hidden behind the painting. "Did he carry anything?" Harriet pressed. Eliza hesitated, then shook her head. I didn't see clearly. Something small, shiny, maybe a key? I think." Her words trailed, uncertain but suggestive. Harriet filed this carefully. The brass key she had discovered might have been handled by Pritchard, intentionally or otherwise. She turned back to the Langleys, pressing them again about the figure they supposedly saw. "You claim the figure was tall, wearing a coat, yet you dismissed it immediately. Why?" Mr. Langley stammered, glancing at his wife. "It was raining heavily. We didn't want to be mistaken. Perhaps our eyes played tricks." Harriet noted the tension between their voices, coordinated yet fragile, defensive yet overly compliant. Harriet observed the group collectively. Pritchard fidgeted with his cuff. Mrs. Langley avoided eye contact. Mr. Langley adjusted his chair nervously. Miss Fenwick maintained rigid composure, and Eliza hovered at the edge, anxious but revealing through minor gestures. Each reaction spoke more than their words. Returning to Brixton's room, Harriet examined the desk again. The indentation for the brass key was faint but unmistakable. She compared it to the cryptic note, E12Q7L5, letters and numbers, possibly a catalogue or inventory system. Her suspicion solidified. Brixton had been trying to access something of importance, and someone had followed him closely, likely knowing both the existence of the key and the code. The blue ink smudge on the blotter and the faint lavender trace were now revealing patterns. Pritchard had been near the room, perhaps using the key or handling objects. The Langleys' contradictory account suggested either a frightened witness or an attempt to conceal what they truly saw. Miss Fenwick's rigid composure hinted at knowledge she was unwilling to share, and Eliza's nervous slips suggested she had observed things others missed, but had been too timid to speak fully. Harriet paused to review the timeline. Brixton alive at supper, retired to his room, handled a key or envelope, a scream, guests reacting inconsistently, a locked room, a small cryptic note, hidden behind the painting, a circle drawn on paper, the first smudge of evidence, the thread, the ink, the lavender, the brass key handled discreetly. And now the inconsistencies in the witnesses' statements painted a pattern. Someone had been deliberately creating confusion while retrieving or concealing an object Brixton possessed. Her attention returned to Pritchard. There was something about his eagerness and timing that warranted direct confrontation. Harriet asked him quietly, "Mr. Pritchard, may I see your coat?" He blinked, startled. "My coat? Why?" "Routine check," Harriet said evenly. "We're tracing the presence of everyone near the East Wing last night." Reluctantly, he removed it. Harriet inspected the inside pocket and found a faint trace of blue ink, identical to that on the blotter. She held it up. Pritchard's composure faltered. His lips parted, then closed. Harriet smiled faintly. The first real crack had appeared in the mask of civility. "You carried something last night," Harriet said quietly, "and you attempted to blend it with the ordinary. Tell me what it was." His eyes darted around the room. The others remained silent, watching, uncertain how to react. "Nothing. I was only curious," he blurted. "I didn't mean harm. I saw Mr. Brixton with something behind the painting. I thought it was valuable." His voice rose, desperate. Harriet nodded, letting him reveal himself without interruption. Small contradictions, hidden motives, and unguarded reactions, these were the true voices of deception, and they spoke louder than any confession. Harriet's observations were now converging. Someone had followed Brixton, used the key, manipulated the room's elements to disguise intent, and created a web of confusion among witnesses. Each person held a fragment, but only when pieced together could the method and motive emerge. The pattern was becoming clear: greed, opportunity, and secrecy intersecting in that small East Wing room. The truth was buried beneath layers of deception, but it was alive in the gestures, the silences, the contradictions, and the subtle evidence that only a patient observer could read. As the storm outside waned, sunlight streaking through the East Wing windows, Harriet Vale felt the first surge of certainty. The crime was no longer merely unsolvable. It was a puzzle slowly yielding to the mind willing to notice what others ignored. Voices of deception had spoken, and she had listened. Harriet spent the next morning in the quiet of the inn's study, mapping out what she already knew: the brass key, the blue ink smudge, the cryptic note, the circle, the thread, and the inconsistent testimonies were all threads, but a single motive remained elusive. Each guest harbored a potential reason to act, yet no theory accounted for all the pieces at once. The crime, simple in its immediate appearance, had blossomed into a maze of competing desires. Pritchard, the bookseller, was the first thread she pulled. His eagerness to explain, the blue ink on his coat pocket, and his sudden admission of curiosity painted him as a man drawn by potential gain. Harriet considered the code E12Q7L5 and the hidden note. Clearly Brixton had access to something valuable, perhaps a ledger of art pieces, rare books, or other treasures. Pritchard had no love for the industrialist personally, but a chance for profit might have been enough. Yet Harriet hesitated. Pritchard's presence alone could not account for the locked room death, the sudden collapse, or Brixton's frozen expression. His motive was greed, but only part of the puzzle. The Langleys, meanwhile, offered a subtler maze of possibilities. Newly married and evidently anxious, they were nervous about being near trouble. Yet Harriet noted the slight tightening in Mrs. Langley's voice when she denied seeing the figure in the corridor. Jealousy, perhaps, or a fear of being implicated in something they barely understood. Their reluctance to admit what they had seen suggested either a fear of reprisal or a desire to shield someone else. Harriet filed the observation carefully, knowing that fear often masqueraded as ignorance. Miss Fenwick, the schoolmistress, remained the most opaque. Her rigid composure and sharp dismissal of the events masked a potential vendetta. Harriet considered that Brixton might have crossed someone in his professional or personal life, and Miss Fenwick's pride could have translated into resentment. The faint twitch in her hands and the careful phrasing of her statements hinted at knowledge she was unwilling to reveal. Harriet did not yet know whether it was fear, guilt, or calculation, but she noted that any genuine motive required not just desire, but opportunity, and Miss Fenwick had access to the corridors and corridor shadows. Eliza, the chambermaid, added a layer of complication. Her anxiety and hesitant disclosures hinted that she had observed crucial actions without understanding their significance. She had noted a tall figure, lavender scent, and something shiny, details that, while minor, suggested proximity to the perpetrator. Harriet realized Eliza might not have intended deception, yet her silence could have been coerced by intimidation or fear of reprisal. In the maze of motive, the girl was a witness caught between loyalty, fear, and the instinct to survive. Harriet spread the collected evidence on the desk. The cryptic note, the ink smudge, the thread, the brass key, the blue circle. Each pointed to deliberate acts, each suggested intent, yet none explicitly revealed the killer. The puzzle lay not in a single piece but in how they all intersected. The key, for instance, could have opened a drawer in Brixton's desk, or a hidden compartment elsewhere in the room. The circle, drawn with a compass or carefully shaped by hand, marked the location of something hidden. Yet only Brixton had drawn it. Whoever followed him must have known the significance of that mark, and the timing of the scream suggested the moment they acted coincided precisely with his discovery of it. Harriet returned to the timeline. Brixton, alive at supper, retired to his room, likely handling the key or envelope, screamed, dead within moments. The only entries into the room were himself and the intruder, if there was one. The height, the coat, the lavender, the shiny object, all details aligning with someone attempting to manipulate the scene. She noted the contradictions among the Langleys, the evasions of Miss Fenwick, and the eagerness of Pritchard. All had potential access, all had potential motive, yet none explanation alone could account for every detail. She decided to probe the personal connections. Brixton had been a wealthy man, with investments, art, and social entanglements. Pritchard, with his books and curiosity for valuable objects, could have been drawn by opportunity. The Langleys were outsiders, newly arrived, yet still observant enough to notice someone's unusual behavior. Miss Fenwick's strict demeanor suggested pride and perhaps resentment, though nothing had yet tied her directly to Brixton's possessions. Eliza, a mere servant, had observed more than anyone, yet lacked power or intent. Harriet considered the interplay of these motives. Greed alone explained the action of a collector or opportunist. Fear or desire to shield another explained the Langleys' evasions. Pride or old resentment explained Miss Fenwick's silence. Observation without action explained Eliza's hesitance. And the suddenness of death indicated that someone had either acted with intimate knowledge of Brixton's habits, or that Brixton himself had triggered a fatal sequence by uncovering something meant to remain hidden. The room itself, a silent witness, suggested that the killer had anticipated every obstacle, including the locked door. She retraced the connections between objects and people. The brass key implied planned access. The ink smudge suggested the perpetrator had handled writing materials. The thread indicated contact with clothing, perhaps Pritchard's coat. The lavender scent indicated proximity, perhaps intentional to mislead. The circle and note revealed Brixton's own efforts to leave clues. Each detail layered motive and opportunity, but none explicitly named a single guilty party. The maze was dense. Every suspect occupied a different branch of it, sometimes intersecting, sometimes misleading. Harriet took a deep breath. Thinking through human behavior as much as physical evidence, people acted out of instinct, fear, greed, resentment, or a combination. Brixton's sudden death meant the murderer had to act swiftly, decisively, and with foreknowledge. Pritchard had greed and opportunity. The Langleys had fear and evasive behavior. Miss Fenwick had pride and possible resentment. Eliza had observation but no power. Each motive intersected with the timing of the crime. To identify the true culprit, Harriet would need to see not only who had reason but who acted in the precise way necessary to make a death appear natural and leave the room locked, seemingly impossible to access. She noted the interactions between suspects. Pritchard had tried to insert himself into observation, perhaps to appear helpful while testing the reactions of others. The Langleys' fear suggested they had witnessed something compromising. Miss Fenwick's rigid posture indicated careful concealment, yet minor gestures betrayed knowledge. Eliza's nervous slips revealed she held fragments of the truth. Harriet realized that each motive created a network of interdependencies, the truth hidden not in a single confession, but in the tensions between lies, fears, and ambitions. To progress, she would need to reconstruct each person's actions with precise timing. She reviewed the East Wing corridor, the shadows cast by the dim morning light, and the placement of furniture in Brixton's room. Each object, each witness statement, each contradiction had to align with the movement of people in space and time. Only then would the maze begin to resolve. Harriet considered her next steps carefully. First, a closer inspection of the key's purpose, where it could have unlocked or accessed hidden compartments. Second, revisiting the cryptic note with potential reference points within Brixton's possessions. Third, observing the reactions of the suspects when these details were discussed, watching for slips, inconsistencies, or sudden realizations. Each of these actions would press the suspects, revealing cracks in their carefully maintained facades. By the afternoon, Harriet had reconstructed enough of the framework to see the outlines of the motive maze. It was not a single line from desire to action, but a tangle of intersecting threads: greed, fear, pride, curiosity, each influencing, each misleading. Someone had acted to seize advantage, someone else to conceal knowledge, and yet another to shield themselves. Only by patiently teasing apart these intertwined motives could the truth emerge, and Harriet Vale was patient to a fault. She sat in the quiet study, looking at her notes and the layout of the inn. The storm had cleared, but tension lingered like the smell of wet wood and ink. The suspects moved about, each performing their own part, unaware that the maze of motives had begun to crystallize. Harriet's sharp mind traced every connection, imagining the sequence that had led to Brixton's death, anticipating where opportunity intersected with desire. The pieces were in place. It was only a matter of time before the tangled threads revealed the hidden path, and the murderer, masked in greed, fear, or pride, would be unmasked. Harriet closed her notebook briefly, allowing herself a moment's pause. The map of motives was vast, yet the edges were beginning to sharpen. Someone among them had turned opportunity into action, hidden intent behind subtle gestures, and manipulated the room itself. All that remained was to press, observe, and unravel the maze until every deception led directly to the guilty hand. The crime that had seemed unsolvable was starting to yield, layer by meticulous layer, to the patient, keen eye of a detective who refused to be deceived. Harriet had spent the morning retracing every action, every gesture, every smudge of ink and thread. By early afternoon, she allowed herself a cautious glance at what she thought might be a breakthrough. The brass key, the cryptic note, and the blue ink smudge all pointed, quite convincingly, to Pritchard. With the key in his possession, a sudden admission about curiosity in the East Wing, and the faint ink stain on his coat, the evidence seemed to converge neatly. The constables were quick to pick up on it. In their eyes, the puzzle had a neat, tidy solution, and they were eager to close the case. Harriet observed the excitement with a wary detachment. Pritchard, the bookseller, had been sweating under questioning, confessing that he had seen the note behind the painting and handled the key. He had claimed to be driven by curiosity, perhaps even ambition, but insisted he had never intended harm. The police nodded, satisfied that motive and opportunity aligned neatly, and prepared to formalize the arrest. The Langleys, Miss Fenwick and Eliza, were questioned once more for completeness, and their statements, when cross-checked, seemed to support the story Pritchard had supplied. Yet Harriet felt a subtle disquiet gnawing at the edges of her mind. Pritchard's actions explained parts of the case, certainly, the handling of the key, the ink smudge, but they did not account for Brixton's sudden collapse, his frozen expression, or the locked room nature of the death. Pritchard had curiosity, he had trespassed, yes, but he had no apparent means to cause the instant death. Something about the timing and Brixton's reaction hinted at a cause that had escaped immediate observation. Harriet's intuition was rarely wrong, and it whispered that this solution was dangerously superficial. The police, however, were already preparing to celebrate their success. Constables moved to secure Pritchard for transport to the nearby town, chatting about how quickly the case had been solved, unaware of the lingering shadows Harriet had seen. She followed silently, questioning each step. She examined the path to the east wing, the placement of the furniture, the dust on the floor, and the subtle discrepancies in the thread on the rug. Pritchard's coat had come into contact with the key and smudge, but the precise sequence of events that led to Brixton's sudden death remained unexplained. Later, Harriet revisited Brixton's room alone. She stood where he had collapsed, staring at the desk, the circle, and the hidden note. Something still did not fit. The circle had been drawn by Brixton himself, yet the paper had been left out of reach. Had he drawn it in anticipation of someone entering the room? Had he tried to signal an imminent threat? And what of the cryptic code behind the painting? Was it merely a map of valuables, or a clue to something more sinister? Harriet studied the shadows cast by the afternoon sun, noting how the hinges of the window caught the light. A lock intact from the inside, yet the room contained anomalies Pritchard could not have engineered alone. She questioned Eliza once again. "Did you notice anything unusual after the scream?" The girl's eyes darted nervously. I saw someone. I thought it was Pritchard, but no, they were gone. I didn't see where." Her hesitation was telling. Harriet leaned closer. "Gone? How?" I don't know. They just weren't there. The hall was empty, but the scent, lavender, it lingered." Harriet's brow arched. Lavender had appeared before, faint but unmistakable. Pritchard had not used perfume, and the smell was too deliberate to be incidental. Harriet filed this quietly. Someone had been there, someone other than Pritchard, and they had left in a way that erased their presence. Returning to the Langleys, Harriet asked for a closer account of the corridor figure they had glimpsed. Mr. Langley insisted it was simply a shadow, yet his wife's sudden tightening of the fingers betrayed discomfort. Harriet noted the minute change. Mrs. Langley's hesitation suggested she had glimpsed more than she admitted, more than a shadow, more than Pritchard. She examined the desk drawers once again. The key fit perfectly into a hidden compartment, revealing a small ledger of receipts and ledgers for Brixton's art acquisitions, but there was nothing in the compartment to suggest a deadly device or poison. The room remained as it had been, and yet Brixton was dead. Harriet felt the familiar weight of a puzzle refusing to yield its truth. Pritchard could be guilty of curiosity, perhaps even theft, but not of orchestrating the locked room death. The constables, confident in their early victory, were blind to this subtle distinction. Later, she observed Miss Fenwick quietly arranging her coat in the lounge. The schoolmistress's hands trembled faintly as she smoothed the fabric, an almost imperceptible sign of agitation. Harriet's instincts told her that pride alone did not explain it. There was knowledge she had withheld, and possibly complicity she had disguised with etiquette. The connections were not overt, but the behavioral cues were enough to suggest the puzzle was deeper than the apparent solution. As evening approached, Harriet revisited the cryptic note. She examined the letters and numbers again, E12Q7L5, and compared them to the ledger Pritchard had supposedly sought. There was no direct correspondence. The code could not merely be a catalogue of items. It suggested a sequence, perhaps a location or a trigger, and the circle, the perfect, unbroken circle, was not just a mark but a pointer, intended to highlight something only Brixton knew how to interpret. Her mind turned to the possibility of deliberate misdirection. Pritchard had been caught handling objects, but what if someone had orchestrated the scene to make him appear culpable? Harriet considered the footprints, the ink smudge, the lavender scent, the timing of the scream, and the behavior of the other guests. Someone had moved with knowledge of the room's layout, of Brixton's actions, and of the investigation's likely assumptions. The early victory was a clever illusion, one that would satisfy the less perceptive, but would crumble under careful scrutiny. Harriet called the constables back to the east wing, under the pretext of reviewing the evidence. As they moved through the corridor, she asked questions in passing, noting reactions, micro-expressions, involuntary gestures, the slightest hesitation before answering routine queries. The Langleys shifted uncomfortably when the key was mentioned. Pritchard fidgeted, of course, but his guilt seemed to pertain to curiosity, not murder. Miss Fenwick's eyes narrowed, as though calculating exposure, and Eliza, hovering near the doorway, seemed on the verge of revealing something but held back, lips pressed tight. Harriet realized the trap laid by the false victory. Authorities, eager to close the case, would arrest Pritchard, and the real orchestrator could continue to move unseen, gathering information, observing reactions, and perhaps planning the next misdirection. The perfect crime, so far, was not in the act itself, but in the careful orchestration of perception. Harriet, however, would not be fooled. She understood that a rush to judgment could allow the true culprit to escape, and she refused to let that happen. As night fell over the silent heart, Harriet paced the east wing corridor once more. The room remained as it had been, silent and seemingly empty, yet alive with secrets. The faint scent of lavender still lingered, almost imperceptible in the cool night air. The brass key rested on her desk, inert but telling. The cryptic note remained tucked in her notebook, its meaning tantalizingly just beyond immediate understanding, and somewhere among the guests, perhaps cloaked in fear, perhaps in pride, perhaps in the careful guise of innocence, the real criminal waited, confident in the illusion they had created. Harriet's gaze swept across the shadowed corridor, and she smiled faintly, a mixture of patience and determination settling over her. The false victory was a distraction, a feint, and the true resolution lay deeper, hidden in the subtleties others had overlooked. She would wait, she would watch, and she would unravel the final threads. The room, the suspects, and the evidence were all pieces of a puzzle that was not yet complete, but Harriet Vale had already begun to see the pattern. The real danger had not yet acted, but she was ready. Harriet sat alone in the study late into the evening, the faint glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines surrounding the silent heart, rattling the windows in gentle, insistent taps. She went over the evidence yet again, the cryptic note, the perfect circle, the brass key, the ink smudge, the blue thread, and the faint trace of lavender. Each anomaly, each gesture, each contradiction seemed to point to someone, yet the puzzle remained incomplete. Her mind, however, had begun to wander along less obvious avenues, past events that might illuminate the present. It was an old file in her memory, a case long considered minor, but never fully resolved, that finally caught her attention. Years ago, a wealthy industrialist in a neighboring county had been threatened over a disputed inheritance. The case had faded quickly, dismissed as a petty quarrel over money. Yet Harriet recalled the key details: a tall man in a dark coat, a sudden disappearance of a servant, and a missing ledger of valuables. The similarities with the present case were too striking to ignore. Brixton's sudden death, the key, the ledger concealed in the desk, all echoed the past incident. Could someone have carried a grudge for years, moving unseen until now, orchestrating events so that history might repeat itself? She began reviewing the guests' histories. Pritchard, the bookseller, had been active in local antiquarian circles for decades, with connections spanning estates and collections. The Langleys had moved frequently, tied to business interests that occasionally intersected with art and antiquities. Miss Fenwick, the schoolmistress, had family with long-standing claims in financial disputes, some overlapping with prominent industrialists. Harriet noted a pattern forming. The suspects were not strangers to one another. Old rivalries, jealousies, and entanglements were buried beneath the polite veneer of civility. A crucial detail emerged as she reviewed Brixton's ledger. Certain entries referenced payments and acquisitions that intersected with properties and estates linked to the suspects' families decades earlier. One entry listed a transaction with a Miss Fenwick's uncle. Another, a rare manuscript Pritchard had recently expressed curiosity about, traced back to a contested inheritance handled by Brixton's firm. Even the Langleys appeared peripherally connected through social and business acquaintances. Harriet's pulse quickened. The crime was no longer an isolated act of opportunity, it was tied to the intricate web of the past, to grudges and claims that had never been resolved. She revisited the East Wing corridor, tracing her steps from the door to Brixton's room. The subtle gap in the floorboard, the dust disturbance, the faint lavender scent, they all suggested careful planning. Whoever orchestrated this had not acted on impulse. They had studied Brixton, understood the room's nuances, and chosen the exact moment to exploit his habits. Harriet considered the circle again, the perfect geometric mark drawn by Brixton himself. Perhaps he had sensed the danger long before the fatal moment. The note behind the painting was not simply a record, it was a warning, a silent testament to a history of concealed threats. Eliza, the chambermaid, had noticed details the others overlooked: the tall figure, the lavender scent, the shiny object. Harriet now suspected that the girl had glimpsed someone connected to the past, someone familiar not merely by sight, but by shared history, someone who had reason to manipulate perception to mislead the investigation. Eliza's nervous hesitations had not been mere timidity. They were born of recognition, subtle and instinctive. Harriet needed to probe this further, to draw out what the girl might reveal if prompted carefully. Returning to the lounge, Harriet spoke to Eliza quietly. "You noticed something, or someone, that seemed familiar. Tell me, did you recognize them?" The girl's eyes widened, and her hands twisted the edge of her apron. I thought I did, Mum. The figure, it reminded me of someone my father spoke of. An old family friend, gone from our lives, but connected to some disputes years ago." She faltered, glancing nervously at Miss Fenwick, who sat primly arranging her sleeve. Harriet leaned forward, noting the reaction, a slight tightening of the jaw, the faint blink, the subtle shift in posture. Recognition had passed between them. Harriet pressed further, gently. "Old disputes? You mean connected to this inn, or to Mr. Brixton?" Eliza swallowed hard. "To Brixton, ma'am. My father, he said Brixton was involved in a disagreement with some local families. He called it unfinished business. I never understood much, but—" Her voice trailed. Harriet filed the detail meticulously. The past, dormant and ignored, had resurfaced with lethal consequences. She turned her attention back to Miss Fenwick. The schoolmistress's poise remained intact, yet the faint traces of unease in her gestures, tightened lips, subtle fidgeting glances toward the Langleys, spoke volumes. Harriet recalled the ledger entry linking Brixton to her uncle's estate. Pride and old grudges could motivate much, especially when opportunity coincided with access. But Miss Fenwick alone did not explain all anomalies. Someone else must have manipulated events to ensure her concealment of knowledge. Pritchard remained an enigma. The bookseller's curiosity and minor infractions could have been opportunistic, yet Harriet wondered whether he, too, had roots entangled in Brixton's past dealings. Perhaps his interest in the note and key had been influenced not only by greed, but by lingering resentment from earlier disputes. A network of small historical grievances appeared to intersect perfectly with the crime. Each guest was linked by layers of family, business, and unresolved claims, a latticework of motive that went far beyond the simple events of the previous night. Harriet paced slowly along the corridor, thinking. The circle drawn by Brixton, the hidden note, the careful placement of items, the locked room, they were part of a warning system, a mechanism built by a man aware of the threats in his own history. Brixton had anticipated the intrusion, had left signals, yet had underestimated the speed and precision of the perpetrator. The lavender scent, the smudged ink, the thread, all indicated careful orchestration designed to mislead and manipulate perception. The past was alive in the present, shaping actions, misdirecting suspicion, and cloaking the real culprit in shadows. Even the Langleys' nervous behavior began to make sense. Newly arrived and unfamiliar with the intricate history of local families, they had glimpsed connections too subtle to articulate fully. Their fear and evasions were not simply timidity, but the instinctive response of outsiders recognizing a hidden network of relationships and old grudges. Harriet noted that their observations, while incomplete, held pieces of the truth if interpreted in the context of historical links. She returned to Brixton's desk and ran her fingers over the ledger, tracing entries that now resonated with old disputes. The seemingly mundane financial and art records had deeper significance, clues pointing to prior grievances, inherited rivalries, and unresolved debts of honor. Harriet realized that to solve this case, she needed to map not only the room, the suspects, and the objects, but also the web of human history connecting them. This was not merely a crime of opportunity, it was a crime rooted in time, memory, and legacy. Harriet's thoughts returned to the cryptic note. The letters and numbers, the perfect circle, the placement behind the painting, they were all part of Brixton's attempt to leave a trail for someone perceptive enough to read it, and Harriet, by now, understood that the past dictated the present. The perpetrator had acted with intimate knowledge of historical disputes, exploiting old grievances to orchestrate both murder and misdirection. As the night deepened, Harriet sat quietly in the East Wing corridor, reviewing each suspect's past connections. Each motive now had context, each deception a historical echo. The room remained still, but it pulsed with the weight of concealed histories, intertwined ambitions, and long-forgotten rivalries now revived in lethal form. Somewhere in the silent heart, the person responsible was hiding in plain sight, confident that the complexity of history would shield them from discovery. Harriet smiled faintly, her resolve sharpening. The shadows of the past had revealed themselves, and with them, the path to uncovering the present truth was emerging. Harriet had spent the better part of the morning reviewing Brixton's ledger and the cryptic note, tracing each thread of connection between the guests and the hidden past. Yet despite hours of careful observation, the true mechanism of the murder remained elusive. She realized that the room and its artifacts had been scrutinized enough. What remained to be tested was the human mind itself. To uncover subtle cracks in deception, Harriet decided on a tactic less conventional than direct questioning. She would use suggestion and observation to prompt a reaction, exploiting the unconscious truth that often betrayed even the most careful liar. She gathered the guests in the lounge once again, under the guise of reviewing the day's events. Mrs. Welford fussed over tea and biscuits, but Harriet ignored the trivialities, focusing instead on the body language, the micro-expressions, and the subtle shifts of attention that had already yielded valuable clues. Pritchard sat rigidly, fidgeting with the hem of his coat. The Langleys exchanged nervous glances, and Miss Fenwick, ever composed, sat with hands folded, a mask of calm concealing tension. Eliza hovered near the doorway, as if hoping to remain unnoticed. Harriet began casually. "It's fascinating how a single detail, unnoticed at the moment, can illuminate an entire sequence of events," she said, voice calm, almost conversational. "For instance, small traces of color, scent, or texture often indicate more than simple presence. They can betray intent." She allowed her gaze to rest momentarily on Pritchard. "Consider a trace of blue ink, or the faint scent of lavender. One might dismiss them, or one might find that they hold significance the observer hadn't anticipated." Pritchard shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking toward the corner where Eliza stood. Harriet continued, letting the silence stretch, giving the mind time to stumble over its own defenses.
"Sometimes,"
she said softly, "people underestimate how much they reveal when they think they are being helpful, when they think they are innocent. A simple demonstration of knowledge or a subtle recognition of a pattern can speak louder than words." Miss Fenwick's composure did not waver outwardly, but Harriet noted a barely perceptible narrowing of the eyes. The Langleys' hands twitched, fidgeting against each other, and Pritchard's lips pressed together as though tasting the warning of a word he had not yet spoken. Harriet allowed these observations to accumulate without comment, storing each micro-reaction in her mind like a careful ledger of human behavior. She turned slightly to Eliza, lowering her voice to near a whisper. "You've noticed things others haven't. Objects moved, scents lingering, shadows that seemed to carry meaning. Did any of those observations connect to people you knew from the past? Perhaps someone whose presence here feels familiar?" The girl's hands trembled, the pale blush returning to her cheeks. I think so, Ma'am. The figure, the scent, it reminded me of someone my father had mentioned. someone connected to old family disputes, but I couldn't be sure. Harriet let her pause, then added, even the slightest recognition can illuminate the truth. The girl's eyes flicked briefly toward Miss Fenwick, whose face remained calm, yet her knuckles whitened as she clasped her hands more tightly. Harriet noted the tension like a wire ready to snap. Harriet then implemented the unconventional part of her strategy. She produced a small, unassuming object, a compass similar in size to the one Brixton had used to draw the circle. Holding it casually, she explained, "This is a tool Brixton used to mark something important. Objects carry context, and context can reveal more than memory alone. I wonder if I place it near various items in the room whose attention will betray knowledge they think hidden." She moved slowly through the lounge, setting the compass near Pritchard's coat, then beside the ledger, then at Miss Fenwick's hands, finally letting it rest near the Langleys. Each placement was deliberate, silent, and unassuming. Harriet watched closely. Pritchard glanced at the compass when it neared him, a subtle flinch of recognition. The Langleys barely moved, though Mrs. Langley's fingers flexed for a moment before she pressed them together. Miss Fenwick, however, showed the most revealing reaction. Her eyes flicked down to the compass, her breath caught ever so slightly, and a muscle twitched in her jaw. Harriet made note, an almost imperceptible crack in her calm facade, triggered not by words, but by an object connected to Brixton's method of marking the hidden. Encouraged, Harriet continued her test. She spoke softly, almost to herself, while moving the compass back to Brixton's desk. Some objects retain the memory of those who handled them. Others betray the intentions of those who seek to possess them. She watched carefully as Miss Fenwick's composure wavered for a second longer, her eyes narrowing, hands twisting subtly. Harriet sensed recognition, knowledge she was hiding, perhaps even fear of exposure. Pritchard, meanwhile, attempted to maintain an air of calm, but Harriet noted his gaze kept flicking to the compass, to the ledger, then back to her, betraying his concern over the uncovering of small details. He had acted out of curiosity, perhaps greed, but not necessarily malice. Yet he had been placed unwittingly into a psychological test that now revealed subtle truths about others. Harriet allowed the quiet to deepen, her eyes roaming the room. She realized that the real breakthrough had not come from forensic evidence, ledger entries, or eyewitness accounts. It had come from observing how individuals reacted under suggestion, when confronted with familiar objects and subtle reminders of the past. The unconventional tactic, relying on intuition and the unconscious mind, had revealed more than any direct questioning could. Finally, she addressed the room in her usual even tone, letting the quiet tension build. "Curiosity can be dangerous," she said, "especially when combined with knowledge that others wish to conceal. Even the smallest slip, an eye, a twitch, a hesitation, can speak volumes." Harriet paused, letting the words sink. She had seen the slip, the crack in the carefully maintained facades, and she knew where to focus her attention next. Miss Fenwick's hands finally relaxed, but the flush in her cheeks betrayed awareness. She had recognized something or someone she did not wish to disclose, and Harriet could sense that her carefully constructed web of calm was now vulnerable. The Langleys' fear remained. The girl's observations hinted at hidden connections, and Pritchard's guilt over minor intrusions remained intact. But it was this subtle fissure in Miss Fenwick's composure that illuminated the next path forward. Harriet allowed herself a small smile. The unconventional clue, the compass, the suggestion, the carefully timed observation of behavior had done what conventional questioning could not. A hidden truth had begun to surface, a subtle crack had appeared in the deception, and the real threads of the murder were starting to reveal themselves. She had the next lead, the point from which the maze of motives and shadows could finally begin to untangle. As the lamp flickered, casting shifting shadows along the walls of the silent heart, Harriet felt a familiar thrill. The crime, rooted in past grievances and masked by false appearances, had begun to yield its secrets. The unconventional tactic had opened the door to the truth, and the person who thought themselves invisible in the shadows was now closer to being exposed than they realized. Harriet had spent the better part of the morning reviewing the subtle reactions she had observed the night before. Miss Fenwick's brief fissure of composure when confronted with the compass was the first real breakthrough. The connections to the past had begun to crystallize, revealing hidden motives. She was preparing to trace those threads further when a sharp knock at the study door startled her. "Inspector Vale?" Mrs. Welford's anxious voice called from the corridor. You must come quickly." Harriet's brow knit. "What is it? It's the East Wing. Something has happened." She followed Mrs. Welford through the dim corridor, the soft click of her boots echoing on the polished floorboards. As they approached Brixton's room, Harriet felt a premonition tightening around her chest. The door was ajar, swinging slightly with the draft. Inside, the scene had changed. The small ledger she had so carefully examined the previous evening, the ledger that held connections to past disputes, payments, and acquisitions, was gone. Even more alarming, the brass key had vanished from its place on the desk. Papers that had been neatly stacked now lay in disarray, as if someone had rifled through them in haste. The Langleys were standing outside the room, faces pale and anxious. We didn't touch anything," Mrs. Langley said quickly. "We were in our room. We only came out when we heard you, ma'am." Mr. Langley nodded vigorously, but his hands fidgeted at his sides, betraying the nervousness of someone suddenly aware of potential danger. Harriet stepped inside cautiously, her eyes sweeping over the room. The hidden circle behind the painting remained, undisturbed, but its significance now seemed more urgent. Whoever had taken the ledger and the key knew precisely what they were looking for. The careful removal suggested intention, planning, and insider knowledge of Brixton's habits. Harriet frowned. Someone was actively working against her investigation. Eliza appeared in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly. I saw someone moving through the corridor last night, near Brixton's door. I thought it was a shadow, but I think they returned while we weren't looking." Her voice was trembling. Harriet's mind raced. The girl's observation aligned perfectly with the missing evidence. Someone had returned, unnoticed, exploiting a moment of inattention to erase the trail. "Did you see who it was?" Harriet asked gently, stepping closer. Eliza shook her head. "No, it was dark, and I didn't get a clear view. I only noticed the smell, lavender, and a faint glint, like metal." Harriet noted the detail, the lavender again, deliberately left or lingering from a person who wished to mislead, and a metallic glint, possibly the key itself or something similar. She turned to the Langleys. "Did either of you see anyone entering or leaving the room after dinner?" Mr. Langley shook his head hastily. "No, we were in our room, as I said. We heard nothing unusual. I swear." Mrs. Langley's eyes darted toward Miss Fenwick briefly, a micro-expression Harriet filed immediately. Miss Fenwick herself remained composed outwardly, but Harriet noticed the smallest shift, a subtle tightening around her lips, a brief blink, as though she had anticipated the discovery before Harriet herself had. The schoolmistress's carefully constructed calm now appeared more fragile, hinting that someone among the guests, or perhaps herself, might have orchestrated the removal. Harriet stepped toward the desk, examining the disorder. Papers had been shuffled but not torn, and the circle remained untouched. Whoever had taken the ledger and key had worked swiftly, deliberately, and with knowledge of where everything important was located. She suspected that the act was not mere theft. It was a calculated effort to misdirect, to remove the evidence before she could interpret it fully. She began reconstructing the likely sequence. The perpetrator had to know the room's layout, Brixton's habits, and the significance of the objects. They had moved quietly, exploiting moments when witnesses were distracted or absent. The repeated lavender scent suggested someone using scent deliberately to distract or mislead, an olfactory signature meant to influence perception. Harriet's mind circled back to Miss Fenwick, Pritchard, and the Langleys, weighing who could combine opportunity, motive, and access to the evidence. Pritchard's behavior that morning was revealing. When Harriet mentioned the missing ledger, He had flinched ever so slightly, his hands clutching the hem of his coat. His previous curiosity and eagerness to intervene now seemed like a convenient alibi, but Harriet knew him too well to believe he could orchestrate a rapid, precise theft and replacement unnoticed. It was more likely he was frightened at the prospect of being implicated again, not the mastermind. The Langleys, on the other hand, had remained anxious and evasive, yet they lacked intimate knowledge of Brixton's room. Their fear seemed genuine, suggesting that they had observed something but were not actors in the theft. Harriet filed this observation, keeping her focus on who could combine knowledge, access, and intent. Miss Fenwick remained the most compelling suspect. Her brief lapse with the compass the previous evening, her reactions to Eliza's observations, and her subtle facial cues now took on new significance. The removal of the ledger and key required not only opportunity, but also precise knowledge, an understanding of Brixton's habits and possessions that matched Miss Fenwick's background, and long-standing familiarity with local affairs. The subtle clues, the lavender, the glint of metal, the timing of the intrusion, suggested someone who could move quietly, anticipate the investigation, and manipulate perceptions. Harriet took a moment to calm her mind, reviewing the chronology. Brixton had returned to his room after dinner, possibly handling the key and note. Pritchard had followed, motivated by curiosity. The scream had alerted the guests. The immediate aftermath left evidence in place. But before Harriet could fully examine it, someone had returned during a moment of distraction, removing the ledger and the key, leaving traces meant to confuse the investigation. She realized that the stakes had shifted. The removal of the evidence was a clear message. The perpetrator knew she was observing, knew she had begun to connect the past with the present, and sought to bury the truth before it could be fully uncovered. Trust had become fragile. Every interaction, every glance, could be manipulated. Harriet now faced a moving target, someone capable of deliberate misdirection, operating in the shadows of the inn. The storm outside had returned, wind rattling the windows, rain streaking the glass in thin, persistent lines. Harriet breathed deeply, letting the rhythmic sound settle her mind. She would need to work with subtlety, patience, and precision. Any rush could allow the perpetrator to escape, and the case, already tangled in history and hidden motives, could slip through her fingers. She spoke quietly to Eliza. "You must tell me everything you saw last night. Every shadow, every scent, every glint, nothing is too small." The girl nodded, trembling. Harriet knew that minor observations, when collected and examined carefully, could reveal patterns the culprit could not anticipate. Turning back to Miss Fenwick, Harriet allowed a slow smile to play at her lips. The theft of evidence had revealed more than it concealed. Whoever had removed the ledger and key had acted under the assumption of control, yet their movements, timing, and traces now formed a map. Observation, patience, and intuition would be her weapons. The vanishing evidence had raised the stakes, but it had also given her a direction, a path through the shadows of deception, leading closer to the truth hidden within the silent heart. Harriet took one last look around the disturbed room. The lamp flickered, casting shifting shadows along the walls. Somewhere among the guests, the perpetrator had acted to conceal the crime and manipulate perception. The challenge was clear, the stakes higher than ever, and the detective was ready. The truth was still within reach, but only if she could outpace the shadow moving against her. Harriet had barely begun cataloguing the clues from the missing ledger and key when a sudden commotion erupted in the hallway outside the study. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed off the polished floorboards, followed by a sharp cry. Harriet's pulse quickened, and she rushed to the corridor, her eyes sweeping for any sign of movement. Mrs. Welford appeared first, breathless and trembling. "Miss Vale, it's Mr. Langley. He's gone." Harriet's mind raced. Gone? What do you mean, gone? The door to his room was locked from the inside. But he's not there. The window, it's open. I don't know how. Mrs. Welford's voice broke, her hands clutching Harriet's arm as if for grounding. Pushing past her, Harriet ran to the Langleys' room. The door was indeed locked from within, the key still resting on the inside table. Yet there was no sign of Mr. Langley. The faint draft of cool air suggested the window had been opened recently, and the faint smell of lavender lingered in the corner, almost tauntingly. Harriet noted the pattern immediately. The signature scent of the perpetrator, used previously to misdirect, now accompanied a disappearance that could only be deliberate. Mrs. Langley clutched her husband's sleeve, tears streaking her cheeks. He was just reading. Then I heard the window, and he was gone. Harriet knelt, inspecting the windowsill. The lock was intact, yet there were faint scratches on the frame, suggesting the window had been tampered with from inside. Outside, the rain had blurred the footprints, but a subtle depression in the soft earth beneath the sill indicated that someone had used a support, perhaps a chair or a stool, to exit. The sequence was impossible for an ordinary guest. It required planning, timing, and the physical skill to leave undetected. Eliza appeared quietly in the doorway, her eyes wide. I saw someone, a tall figure, moving along the east corridor before the storm started. I thought it must have been the same as before. Harriet's jaw tightened. The perpetrator was bold, confident, and increasingly unrestrained. Whoever they were, they had recognized that removing evidence alone would not suffice. They had escalated, now targeting individuals to control the investigation. Harriet retraced the sequence: the first murder, the theft of the ledger, and now Mr. Langley's disappearance indicated a deliberate escalation. The villain was several steps ahead, orchestrating events to mislead the authorities, to test the reactions of the witnesses, and perhaps to instill fear. The storm outside provided cover, but the perpetrator had anticipated every element: the locked doors, the open window, the distraction of the missing evidence. Harriet's instincts told her this was no random act. It was a calculated signal that the investigation must follow a precise path, or more lives could be at risk. She addressed Mrs. Langley, her tone calm but firm. "We need to consider that he may still be nearby. Did he mention leaving the room at any time, or did anyone see him step outside?" Mrs. Langley shook her head, clutching her apron. "No, he stayed in the room. I didn't see anyone come or go." Harriet's eyes scanned the surroundings. The faint scratches, the disturbed floorboards near the window, and the lingering lavender all pointed to an intruder who knew exactly how to create an illusion. It was clear the perpetrator had observed not only Brixton and Pritchard, but also the movements of every guest. The disappearance was meant to manipulate perception, an impossible exit to sow confusion, and a message to Harriet herself that she was being watched, tested, and challenged. Returning to the study, Harriet reviewed the placement of the compass and the reactions it had elicited the previous evening. Miss Fenwick had shown the most pronounced fissure in her composure. Could she be involved in this new escalation? Harriet considered the implications. A second disappearance after the ledger and key was stolen suggested either direct action or orchestration from someone fully aware of every observer's reactions, someone who had not been caught by the initial psychological test. She decided to confront the possibilities strategically. The perpetrator knows we are observing. They have taken steps to manipulate our assumptions. Whoever orchestrated this knows human behavior intimately and can predict our responses. She addressed Eliza, keeping the girl close for reassurance. "You noticed the figure in the corridor last night. Think carefully. What did you see about their mannerisms, clothing, anything that seemed deliberate?" Eliza hesitated, then whispered, "The coat, tall, dark, and the way they moved, careful, like someone who has done this before. And, Mum, the lavender, it felt like they wanted someone to notice, to mislead." Harriet nodded. The signature, the deliberate use of scent, and the careful control of visibility all reinforced her previous deductions. The villain was highly intelligent, manipulative, and experienced in both observation and deception. Harriet turned to Miss Fenwick, carefully observing her posture. The schoolmistress had been composed earlier, but now there was a subtle tension in her shoulders, a minute hesitation in her breathing. Harriet's eyes locked on the slight twitch of her fingers. She spoke softly but with precision. "Miss Fenwick, someone has manipulated both perception and circumstance to mislead us. You are aware of patterns, movements, and sequences that we are only beginning to reconstruct. Your insight or concealment may prove critical. Miss Fenwick's lips pressed together, and for a heartbeat, Harriet saw the smallest acknowledgement. A flicker in the eye, a micro-expression revealing recognition, perhaps guilt or fear. The psychological web had begun to tighten, and the villain's audacity had inadvertently given Harriet a new lead. Harriet realized that the storm, the vanishing evidence, and Mr. Langley's disappearance were not isolated incidents, but part of a calculated progression. The perpetrator was testing reactions, creating diversions, and escalating tension to maintain control over the investigation. Now, Harriet was not merely solving a murder. She was racing against a mind several steps ahead, a strategist who could strike again unless anticipated. She quickly organized a plan. First, she would secure the inn as best as possible, monitoring exits and possible escape routes. Then she would gather subtle observations from each guest, noting reactions to hypothetical scenarios that might provoke slips or contradictions. Finally, she would revisit Brixton's notes and the remaining pieces of evidence with fresh perspective, seeking connections the perpetrator had not anticipated. Every micro-reaction, every minor slip, could now illuminate the next move of this calculating criminal. As the wind rattled the windows and lightning traced jagged lines across the sky, Harriet understood the gravity of the situation. The villain was no longer operating in secret. They had made themselves visible through audacious acts and deliberate manipulations. The second disappearance had shifted the investigation from reconstruction to prevention. Harriet's mind raced, plotting each move, anticipating the perpetrator's logic, and preparing for the next inevitable strike. The silent heart had become a crucible of hidden histories, human motives, and calculated danger, and Harriet Vale stood at its center, determined to unravel the complex web before another life was claimed. Harriet sat in the lounge late into the night, the storm outside lashing against the windows, the howling wind mingling with the distant roll of thunder. The inn felt charged, tense, every shadow in the corners of the room threatening to conceal some truth yet to be revealed. Her thoughts whirred with the sequence of events. Brixton's death, the theft of the ledger and brass key, and now Mr. Langley's disappearance. Every incident seemed chaotic, yet Harriet had begun to sense a hidden structure, a deliberate rhythm in the disorder. She revisited the subtle clues she had collected over the past days. Pritchard's nervousness, the Langley's evasion, Miss Fenwick's micro-expressions, and Eliza's careful observations all pointed to an intelligent orchestrator, someone who understood how to manipulate perception. Yet the breakthrough came not from the large or obvious elements, but from something small, a misplaced object, almost laughably minor, that she had overlooked amid the storm of events. It was the compass again, resting on the desk from the previous evening. Harriet traced the faint scratch marks along its edge, and then the subtle alignment with the circular mark Brixton had drawn. Something about its placement now struck her. The way it had been left deliberately askew after the first psychological test, as if pointing to a sequence rather than a position. And then she remembered Eliza's remark about the metallic glint and the lavender scent accompanying the movement of the figure in the corridor. That tiny combination, a reflective object, a subtle scent, was repeated across multiple incidents. The compass, the key, the ledger, all markers in a trail, almost imperceptible unless one looked for pattern rather than chaos. She returned to the ledger, imagining it in the hands of the thief. The entries, once dismissed as mere records of art transactions, began to resonate differently. Each acquisition, each payment, each ledger note corresponded not only to objects of value, but also to historical grudges. A series of seemingly random transactions now revealed themselves as deliberate signposts, indicating who held motive, who had access, and crucially, who had knowledge of the hidden mechanisms within Brixton's rooms. Harriet's mind connected the sequence. Brixton had anticipated an intrusion, leaving the circular mark and the note to signal an intended path of discovery to anyone sharp enough to perceive it. The compass and the key were not merely physical tools, but indicators of timing and movement. Whoever had removed the ledger and brass key was not acting blindly. They were manipulating the sequence of discovery to mislead and control the investigation. Each move, previously seen as unpredictable, now formed part of a coherent pattern. She mapped it out quietly in her mind. First, the death itself, occurring in a locked room designed to suggest impossibility. Next, Pritchard's intervention, small, seemingly inconsequential, yet providing a distraction that diverted attention. Then the theft of the ledger and key, a deliberate erasure intended to confuse. And finally, Mr. Langley's disappearance, an escalation to draw attention, create urgency, and provoke panic. The pattern was layered, escalating, and highly calculated. Harriet's eyes swept across the room. The Langleys' unease, Miss Fenwick's tension, Pritchard's nervous glances, they all fell into place within this framework. She recalled Miss Fenwick's subtle micro-expression when the compass was placed near her hands, her lips pressed tightly, fingers flexing. That slight crack in her composure was now unmistakable as the first indicator of the orchestrator's identity. All other anomalies, the lavender scent, the metallic glint, the careful timing of movements, pointed toward her as the one manipulating events from behind a veil of civility. Harriet turned her attention to Brixton's initial notes. The seemingly arbitrary letters and numbers, E12Q7L5, now suggested a mapping system corresponding to specific locations within the inn, aligned with the sequence of intended discovery. Brixton had created a trail for the observant, and Miss Fenwick had moved along it in a calculated manner, anticipating the reactions of both guests and investigator. She had underestimated Harriet's ability to discern psychological patterns, but the tiny slip of recognition had left her exposed. Eliza, ever observant, had also played an unwitting role in revealing the pattern. Her attention to the corridor figure, the lavender, and the metallic glint provided Harriet with the missing links between incidents. By aligning Eliza's observations with the sequence of theft, disappearance, and the original murder, Harriet saw clearly how the orchestrator had used distraction and fear to control the narrative. Each incident was a piece of a puzzle that until now seemed scattered. Now, the edges began to fit precisely. Harriet allowed herself a slow smile. The beauty of the pattern lay in its simplicity, hidden beneath layers of chaos. Miss Fenwick's knowledge of past disputes, her familiarity with Brixton's methods, and her ability to manipulate perception created the perfect framework for misdirection. Each detail, previously dismissed as trivial, the offhand glance, the twist of a hand, the scent lingering in a corridor, was now a key to understanding the whole sequence of events. She approached Miss Fenwick in the lounge, maintaining a calm conversational tone. "Miss Fenwick," Harriet began, letting the words settle, "you must appreciate how challenging it can be to orchestrate events so that every observer reacts as intended. It requires foresight, timing, and an intimate understanding of human behavior." The schoolmistress's face remained composed outwardly, but Harriet noted the brief flicker of recognition, the slight stiffening of her posture. "Indeed," Miss Fenwick said carefully, voice measured, yet her eyes betrayed a tension she could not completely hide. "Observing and anticipating, those are qualities I admire, though I would hope they are not necessary in our current circumstances." Harriet's gaze swept over her, slow and deliberate. Observing closely, one can detect subtle cracks, tiny gestures, small reactions. Even the most careful orchestration leaves traces. The sequence of events here, the death, the removal of the ledger, the disappearance of Mr. Langley, has revealed a pattern. And patterns, Miss Fenwick, are not easily concealed. The faintest hesitation passed across Miss Fenwick's features, just enough for Harriet to confirm the theory forming in her mind. The small clue, the almost imperceptible reaction to the compass, the alignment of the circular mark, the faint scent of lavender, had all been in plain sight, waiting for a discerning observer to perceive the orchestration behind the chaos. Harriet now had the confidence of clarity. The case, which had seemed a series of chaotic, unpredictable events, had coalesced into a discernible structure. The perpetrator had relied on misdirection, psychological manipulation, and historical grievances to create a web of deception. Yet the single, seemingly insignificant detail, the flicker of recognition, the reaction to a small object, the habitual patterns of behavior, had illuminated the entire sequence. She would confront Miss Fenwick carefully, using the emerging pattern to draw out the final truth. The next moves had to be precise. The villain was aware, intelligent, and manipulative. But with the pattern now visible, Harriet could anticipate, predict, and corner the orchestrator before any further harm occurred. The silent heart, shrouded in storm and shadow, had yielded its secret. The key to unraveling the mystery lay not in grand gestures, but in the subtle, persistent consistency of behavior, the pattern emerging from chaos, patiently waiting to be recognized. Harriet sat in the quiet of the lounge, the storm having subsided to a soft drizzle, though the air remained thick with tension. She had spent the past hours piecing together the pattern that connected the seemingly chaotic events at the Silent Heart, the initial murder, the theft of the ledger and key, and Mr. Langley's disappearance. Each incident, once isolated, now formed a coherent sequence of deliberate misdirection and psychological manipulation. Yet the question that still lingered in Harriet's mind was why? Why had someone gone to such extreme lengths, not simply to remove evidence or frighten witnesses, but to orchestrate a complex, escalating series of acts that risked exposure at every turn? Her gaze shifted to Miss Fenwick, seated calmly but with subtle tension in her posture. The schoolmistress had maintained her composure admirably throughout the investigation, yet the smallest gestures had betrayed cracks, revealing her role in orchestrating events. Harriet knew that the key to understanding the full motive lay not only in history, opportunity, or petty grievances, but in the deeper psychology that drove Miss Fenwick's actions. Harriet approached her slowly, choosing words carefully. "Miss Fenwick, patterns are revealing, but they do not explain intent. I understand the sequence of events, the manipulations, and the misdirections, but I am still uncertain about your reason. Why, after all these years, did you feel compelled to act in this manner?" Miss Fenwick's hands twitched slightly, her eyes narrowing. She studied Harriet for a long moment before speaking, her voice soft but resolute. "It's not merely about money, Miss Vale. It's never been that simple. Brixton, he represented more than a ledger or a property dispute. He embodied the failure of justice, the imbalance of influence, the way the past can suffocate the present if left unchallenged." Harriet listened intently, sensing the layers behind the words. Miss Fenwick's tone was calm, yet beneath it simmered a complex web of resentment and obsession. "Explain," Harriet prompted gently. "You mentioned justice, imbalance. What does that mean in concrete terms? What drove you to orchestrate such precise and dangerous acts?" Miss Fenwick's gaze shifted, recalling memories Harriet could almost see flickering behind her eyes. "Brixton, years ago, was involved in the settlement of my family's affairs. My uncle, gentle, fair-minded, was cheated of an inheritance, something that should have been rightfully ours. Brixton managed the transaction, controlling every document, every ledger, every signature. And the result, the injustice went unnoticed, unchallenged. He prospered. We suffered quietly. I swore then that such imbalance would not persist, not through neglect, not through chance." Harriet's mind raced. The motive was no longer petty greed or surface-level revenge. It was a long-standing obsession, a psychological need to assert control and correct perceived injustice. "So this," Harriet said, gesturing at the events unfolding in the inn, the death, the theft, the disappearances, it's about rectifying that past? About imposing your sense of order on what you viewed as wrong?" Miss Fenwick nodded, faintly, almost imperceptibly. "Yes. Brixton's death was inevitable in the sense that it was necessary to trigger the sequence. Each subsequent act, the removal of the ledger, the disappearance of Mr. Langley, was designed to expose the weaknesses in perception, to reveal who could be trusted and who would falter when confronted with truth. The pattern, the manipulation, the fear, they were all tests tests of observation, attention, comprehension, and if those tests failed, chaos would ensue. But the deeper truth had to be revealed. Harriet understood now that Miss Fenwick's orchestration was both strategic and psychological. She had crafted a series of events that compelled the observant to recognize hidden truths, while simultaneously punishing those she considered inattentive, careless, or complicit. Her actions were not motivated solely by revenge. They were driven by a deep-seated need to assert moral order according to her own rigid principles, to correct what she perceived as enduring injustices, and to ensure the past was acknowledged and accounted for. "Your actions were meticulously planned," Harriet said, her voice quiet but firm. "You relied on psychological cues, the manipulation of perception, and careful orchestration to control the investigation. But why escalate to murder and disappearances? Why risk detection?" Miss Fenwick's eyes glistened with a strange intensity. "Because the past does not forgive easily. Injustice festers quietly, but once recognized, it demands attention. I needed to force awareness, to compel recognition of the wrongs that had been buried. And Brixton, he had become a symbol of all that was ignored, all that was unresolved. He represented the failure of society to heed the lessons of history. His presence at the Silent Heart was an opportunity, a final chance to enact the pattern that had been hidden, dormant for so long." Harriet felt the gravity of the revelation settle in her chest. The crime, she realized, had been psychological as much as physical. Miss Fenwick's meticulous orchestration was not merely to conceal or destroy evidence, it was a demonstration of control, a projection of her own moral calculus onto the chaotic world around her. Each act, from Brixton's death to the staged disappearance, was intended to expose the flawed assumptions and inattentiveness of those around her, to compel understanding, and to assert her vision of justice. She allowed a moment of silence, letting the magnitude of the truth sink in. The villain's motive was far more complex and far more disturbing than she had imagined. It was not a matter of financial gain or petty vengeance, but a profound, obsessive need to impose moral order, to make the past reckon with the present, and to force recognition of wrongs that had long been ignored. The crimes were acts of pedagogy as much as violence, lessons encoded in fear and deception, meant to awaken awareness. "Miss Fenwick," Harriet said finally, her voice steady, "you have revealed the true motive. It is clear now that your actions are rooted in a desire to correct what you see as a historical imbalance, to assert justice according to your own principles. But the law cannot be subverted, nor can morality be enforced through orchestrated fear and murder. The pattern is clear, and the evidence now connects you to every act at the Silent Heart." The schoolmistress's lips pressed together. There was no denial, only the quiet, unsettling acknowledgement of the rationale behind the orchestration. Harriet could sense the collision of intellect and obsession that had driven every action, the careful sequencing designed to manipulate perception, and the psychological pressure applied to each guest. It was a motive born of both intellect and compulsion, a fusion of strategic planning and a deep moral imperative warped into obsession. Harriet rose slowly, the storm having finally passed, leaving a tense calm over the inn. The hidden motive, long buried in history, shaped by perceived injustice and the desire for control, had been fully revealed. The pattern, the sequence, the deliberate manipulations, all had been in service of an idea far more profound and unsettling than mere greed or revenge. And now, with understanding of the psychological drive behind the crimes, Harriet was poised to ensure that justice would not only recognize the truth, but also prevent further harm. As the first light of dawn seeped through the windows, Harriet felt the weight of the revelation settle. The Silent Heart had held secrets for decades, but at last the hidden motive was exposed, a shocking, obsessive drive to correct the past, to manipulate the present, and to impose a moral reckoning at any cost. Harriet's next task was clear. She had to navigate the final confrontation, reconcile human complexity with justice, and bring resolution to a case shaped by the intricate, unsettling psychology of the villain. Harriet spent the remainder of the morning arranging the final pieces. She had mapped the pattern, reconstructed the sequence, and understood the psychological drive behind every act, the hidden motive that had driven Miss Fenwick to orchestrate death, deception, and disappearance. Now it was time to confront the architect of the chaos directly, to force the culmination of the sequence and ensure justice would be served before another life could be jeopardized. The silent heart was quiet, the storm having left the surrounding countryside slick and shadowed. Harriet gathered the remaining guests in the lounge under a pretense of discussion. The Langleys clutched each other nervously, their eyes flicking to the door at every creak. Pritchard sat stiffly, hands clenched, while Eliza hovered near the hearth, her gaze darting between Harriet and the schoolmistress. Miss Fenwick sat calmly in her usual chair, her posture perfect, the faintest trace of tension in her fingers and jaw betraying her awareness of the trap closing around her. Harriet began in her even, deliberate tone. "Miss Fenwick, we have reviewed the sequence of events here over the past days. The murder of Mr. Brixton, the removal of the ledger, and the disappearance of Mr. Langley, all have been calculated and deliberate. You have orchestrated a pattern, relying on psychological manipulation, timing, and fear. But patterns once perceived leave no room for concealment." Miss Fenwick's gaze remained steady, though her eyes flicked momentarily to the window, as if measuring escape. "I see," she said softly, her voice calm, almost detached. "And what is it that you believe you have discerned, Miss Vale? That I am some ordinary criminal to be caught in a trap?" Harriet moved closer, maintaining unflinching composure. "I believe you have done more than that. You have created a sequence relying on small, deliberate signals to manipulate perception and control the investigation. But the smallest slip, the slightest reaction, has revealed more than you intended. Your motive is clear, a need to impose moral order, to correct perceived historical injustice, and to test the observant." The schoolmistress's lips pressed into a thin line. A subtle exhale betrayed her tension, though her mask remained largely intact. "You flatter yourself," she said. "I am merely a student of human behavior. I orchestrated a lesson, and you have learned it, perhaps too well." Harriet's eyes swept over the guests. "And yet, the law does not condone lessons through murder, Miss Fenwick. You have manipulated events with precision, but the truth has a persistence of its own. You underestimated the observant, and that is why we are here." For a heartbeat, silence settled over the room. Then Harriet activated the final element of her plan, a psychological device to draw out confession. She casually mentioned a detail Miss Fenwick had tried to mask, the faint scratches near the window in Mr. Langley's room. "The method used to simulate his disappearance," she said, voice low, "was clever. But it left traces. Metal against wood, fingerprints brushed faintly over the sill. A subtle sequence meant to mislead, but it has revealed intent, knowledge, and timing." Miss Fenwick's composure flickered, just barely perceptible. Her eyes darted briefly to the hearth where Eliza stood, then back to Harriet. "So you noticed," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, carrying the first note of tension. "Yes," Harriet replied calmly, "and every subsequent act, the removal of the ledger, the use of scent, the precise timing of each incident, correlates to your knowledge, your manipulation, your pattern. You have been careful, meticulous. But even the most careful mind can reveal itself under observation." The flicker became a crack. Miss Fenwick leaned forward slightly, fingers pressing into the chair arms. Her voice quivered now with restrained intensity. "You presume to understand me, my motives, my methods." "I do," Harriet said firmly, stepping closer. "I understand that you acted out of obsession, to correct a perceived injustice from the past. You have used fear, manipulation, and psychological insight to orchestrate events. But patterns, once perceived, are inexorable. The truth cannot be hidden." For the first time, the schoolmistress's composure broke entirely. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate, almost theatrical. "And what of it? You think you have cornered me? That all these threads, all these intricate steps lead to your triumph?" Harriet remained calm, her gaze unflinching. "I have anticipated every move, every reaction, every attempt to mislead." The pattern you created has been observed, reconstructed, and understood. There is no escape without consequence, Miss Fenwick. The orchestrations, the manipulations, the disappearances, they are all accounted for. The law will follow. Miss Fenwick's eyes glistened with something unidentifiable, frustration, fear, perhaps even admiration. She paused, then exhaled slowly, a long tremor of resignation passing through her. "So, you have unraveled the lesson," she whispered, voice brittle. "Yes, the injustice of the past. The lessons buried in time. I see now that even clever designs cannot defy observation indefinitely." Harriet's tone softened slightly, though her authority remained absolute. "You need not deny the truth any longer. The pattern is complete, the motive revealed, and the evidence sufficient. Confession, if voluntary, is always preferable to concealment. The consequences, however, will not change." The schoolmistress sank back into her chair, finally unresisting. "Very well," she said quietly. "I acted as I did because the world had ignored the wrongs that had been committed. Brixton represented a system that perpetuated injustice. I could not allow it to continue. I intended no harm beyond revelation. Yet, of course, things escalated." Harriet nodded. Every psychological element, every carefully observed reaction had led to this moment. Miss Fenwick's confession, her admission of motive, and the acknowledgement of sequence completed the investigation. The villain had been unmasked, not merely as a perpetrator of crime, but as a human being driven by obsession, moral fixation, and a need to correct the past. "Your motives, however complex, do not absolve the acts committed," Harriet said. "You will be held accountable, but the truth is now clear, and no further harm will occur. The pattern is understood, the manipulations exposed, and the consequences assured." Miss Fenwick's shoulders slumped, a quiet resignation settling over her. She had attempted to control every element, manipulate every perception, and orchestrate the chaos with precision. But Harriet had anticipated, observed, and reconstructed every step. The final confrontation, long anticipated and carefully executed, had succeeded. The silent heart, with all its shadows, its hidden patterns, and its carefully concealed motives, had finally yielded the truth. Harriet allowed herself a brief, controlled exhale. The guests remained silent, tension lingering in the room, but the crisis had passed. The orchestrator had been confronted, the hidden motives revealed, and the pattern exposed. The storm outside had faded, and with it, the uncertainty that had hung over the inn for days. Justice, precise and deliberate, had prevailed, and Harriet Vale had ensured that the sequence of events, so carefully constructed, so psychologically complex, would now end not in further chaos, but in resolution. The morning sun filtered weakly through the draped windows of the Silent Heart, casting long, muted shadows across the lounge. Harriet had spent hours meticulously documenting the sequence of events, the patterns, and Miss Fenwick's confession, ensuring every detail aligned with the reconstructed timeline. The guests had begun to breathe a cautious sigh of relief, the tension of the past days easing, though nervous energy still lingered in corners of the room. Harriet moved among them, quietly reviewing statements, double-checking timelines, and ensuring no anomaly remained unchecked. Every trace, every slip, every reaction had been accounted for, or so it seemed. Miss Fenwick sat quietly, her posture subdued but alert, eyes flicking to Harriet occasionally as though waiting for some final acknowledgement. The storm had passed, the inn seemed finally under control. It was then that Eliza, still nervous from the previous night's events, tugged lightly at Harriet's sleeve. "Miss Vale, I noticed something odd last night," she whispered, her voice trembling. "When I went to check on Mr. Langley after the disappearance, I thought I saw something near the west wing. I didn't think much of it at the time, but it was strange." Harriet's brow furrowed. "Strange how, Eliza?" The girl hesitated, biting her lip. "A shadow. I think it moved differently than anyone else. It wasn't Miss Fenwick or the Langleys. It seemed deliberate, like someone was watching but careful not to be seen." Harriet's mind snapped into motion. She had reconstructed the pattern, understood the motives, and confronted Miss Fenwick. But something Eliza said hinted at a missing link, a presence she had not accounted for. The movements, the deliberate orchestration, had always appeared to come solely from the schoolmistress. But now the possibility arose that another hand had been at work, operating behind the scenes, manipulating events, even as Miss Fenwick's role unfolded. She walked swiftly to the west wing, Eliza trailing silently behind her. The corridor was empty, the air cool and slightly musty. Harriet's eyes scanned the walls, the floors, and the corners. There were no footprints in the dust, no obvious signs of entry, but she had learned not to rely on surface evidence alone. The slightest detail, easily overlooked, could reveal intent. At the far end of the hallway, a faint scratch on the polished wooden floor caught her attention. It was subtle but deliberate, a mark that suggested a recent disturbance. Someone had moved furniture or objects, masking movement or creating a false trail. Harriet crouched, inspecting the area carefully, and noticed a sliver of paper protruding from beneath the skirting board. She retrieved it gently, revealing a folded note, edges frayed and damp from the storm. Opening it, Harriet read the carefully written words. "The pattern you observed is only part of the design. True control is hidden. Observe carefully or it will be lost again." A chill ran down her spine. The note was in a hand unfamiliar to her, not Miss Fenwick's. The handwriting was precise, almost clinical, with a deliberate flourish that suggested intellect and careful planning. Someone else had been orchestrating events, working alongside, or perhaps above, Miss Fenwick, ensuring that the lessons, misdirections, and manipulations unfolded exactly as intended. The implication was staggering. The confessed villain was not the ultimate architect. Harriet turned back toward the lounge, her mind racing. Miss Fenwick's calm demeanor suddenly appeared more like a carefully constructed facade, maintained even under observation. The confession, while truthful regarding her motives, had only been part of the broader picture. There was a second orchestrator, a shadow lurking behind the apparent sequence, pulling strings in the background, ensuring that events escalated according to an even more elaborate design. She returned to the lounge, eyes sharp, scanning each guest. Every reaction mattered now. The subtle twitches, the diverted gaze, the faint hesitation in speech. The Langleys seemed genuinely shaken but innocent. Pritchard fidgeted in his chair as always, yet his movements now felt deliberate, as though he had anticipated the revelation and positioned himself accordingly. Miss Fenwick, however, met Harriet's gaze directly, an almost imperceptible tension gripping her shoulders. "Miss Fenwick?" Harriet said, voice steady but firm. "There is more here than you have admitted. Someone else has been involved in orchestrating these events. Your confession was genuine regarding your motives, but it seems you were not the only mind guiding the pattern." The schoolmistress's eyes widened slightly, just enough to betray surprise. She recovered almost immediately. You think there is another, perhaps a rival from the past? An associate I never considered?" Harriet shook her head slowly. "Someone close enough to observe, to anticipate your moves, and to ensure the escalation unfolded perfectly. They have left a message, hidden, subtle, but deliberate. It confirms that the orchestration extended beyond your actions. The final act is yet to be revealed." A tense silence fell over the room. The guests, previously relieved, now stiffened, sensing the weight of Harriet's observation. Even Miss Fenwick seemed unsettled, a flicker of unease passing across her features. Then a soft sound, barely audible over the creaking floorboards, echoed from the corridor leading to the servants' quarters. Harriet's eyes darted toward the noise. Someone was moving deliberately yet carefully, trying not to draw attention. She stepped forward, voice low but commanding. "Step into the light." There is no need for further deception. From the shadowed doorway emerged a figure, tall, precise, and calm. It was Pritchard. His eyes, once nervous and deferential, now held a controlled intensity. "Miss Vale," he said quietly, almost deferentially, "it seems you have seen more than I anticipated." "The pattern?" "Yes," Miss Fenwick initiated parts of it. "But the true design? That has been my responsibility all along." Harriet's pulse quickened, though her composure remained unbroken. "You?" she asked, voice measured. "You manipulated events from behind the scenes. You escalated the incidents, ensuring the misdirection, the disappearances, and the apparent confessions would unfold as you intended?" Pritchard nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible smile tugging at his lips. "I admired the schoolmistress's intellect, but her sense of timing and observation was incomplete. The pattern required refinement, escalation, and subtle control. Brixton's death, the ledger, the window, all part of the sequence. She believed she guided events. In truth, she was one piece among many, an instrument to shape the reactions of the observant." Harriet's mind raced, assembling the revelation. The confessed villain, the orchestrated lessons, the manipulations, they had all been directed and augmented by Pritchard, who had operated in shadow, ensuring that the sequence achieved his intended purpose. Miss Fenwick's obsession and psychological compulsion had been genuine, but Pritchard had amplified them, guiding them to a far more dangerous conclusion. "You underestimated me," Pritchard continued, voice steady, measured, almost clinical. "The pattern required observation, timing, and psychological insight. You detected the surface-level orchestration, Miss Vale, but the deeper design, my design, remained concealed. Until now." Harriet's eyes locked on his, her calm presence unwavering. "The pattern is no longer concealed," she said firmly. "Every act, every manipulation, every escalation has been observed, reconstructed, and understood. There is no further room for evasion. The final revelation has emerged, and the consequences of your orchestration will be enforced." For the first time, Pritchard's composed expression flickered. The weight of recognition, the realization that his intricate, deliberate control had been anticipated and neutralized, passed over his features. Harriet's brilliance had traced the hidden architecture behind the chaos, revealing the ultimate manipulator and dismantling the illusion of omnipotence he had crafted. The silent heart, with its shadows, storms, and carefully layered deceptions, had finally yielded its truth. The confessed villain was no longer the sole architect, and the last-minute twist, the revelation of the true mastermind, had tested Harriet's insight, perception, and patience to their limits. Yet, as she stepped closer to Pritchard, composed and resolute, she knew that even the most intricate patterns could not escape the clarity of careful observation and steadfast intellect. The tension in the lounge was palpable as Harriet confronted Pritchard, the revelation of his hidden orchestration reverberating through the room. The guests, previously relieved by Miss Fenwick's confession, now sat in stunned silence, uncertainty etched on every face. Even the schoolmistress herself appeared unnerved, a rare loss of composure betraying the realization that her carefully crafted role had been only part of a more elaborate design. Harriet's mind worked swiftly, cataloguing each element of the pattern, the motives, and the psychology that had guided both conspirators, preparing for the final reckoning. "Pritchard," Harriet said, voice calm but firm, "you manipulated events at every stage, amplifying Miss Fenwick's obsessive designs, orchestrating each movement and reaction, and ensuring that the pattern achieved maximum effect. Your hand guided the escalation of chaos, yet even your intricate plan has left traces." He met her gaze steadily, a hint of admiration in his eyes. Traces, perhaps, but not errors. The sequence was controlled, precise. No one could have anticipated every nuance. Harriet's lips pressed into a thin line. "Ah, but I did. Every nuance, every deliberate misdirection, every psychological cue was anticipated. You left subtle fingerprints, tiny inconsistencies that betrayed control without detection. The compass scratches, the placement of the ledger, the sequence of the lavender scent, each was a signal of orchestration, deliberately subtle, but revealing if observed carefully. Even Miss Fenwick's reactions, so expertly managed, became part of the evidence against you. The truth leaves a mark, Pritchard, and I have followed each one." Pritchard's composure faltered slightly, a flicker of unease passing through his controlled expression. Harriet moved closer, her presence commanding yet restrained. "The crimes you orchestrated were not motivated solely by malice or opportunity. They were a projection of calculated obsession, a need to manipulate perception and assert control. You thought the lessons would remain concealed, that the pattern would mislead and intimidate. But patterns, no matter how elaborate, are not immune to observation. The final act, your hidden control, has been revealed. Miss Fenwick remained seated, her hands folded tightly, eyes darting between Harriet and Pritchard. For the first time she seemed diminished, her role in the grander design clear but secondary. I followed what I believed to be my own plan, she murmured, voice trembling. I did not realize someone was guiding, refining, amplifying it. Harriet nodded slowly, acknowledging the schoolmistress's honesty while keeping her focus on Pritchard. Your orchestration required manipulation, control, and psychological precision. Yet even the most disciplined mind leaves small errors. Every misdirection you employed, every staged disappearance, every timed intervention, every attempt to mislead, has been traced and understood. The ultimate design, once obscured, is now laid bare. Pritchard took a step back, lips pressing together. And what do you intend to do, Miss Vale? You have unraveled the pattern, yes, but the sequence can be disrupted. The system is still mine to manipulate. Harriet's eyes narrowed, voice unwavering. The pattern has been disrupted. The orchestration is exposed. The law, which you sought to evade through manipulation and fear, will now proceed according to its natural course. You will not escape, Pritchard. Not while the traces you left continue to reveal the truth. For a heartbeat, he hesitated, calculating, weighing options, and yet there was no path forward. Every movement he might have made, every escape he might have attempted, had been anticipated. Harriet had reconstructed the chain of events with surgical precision, her mind tracing the hidden threads that connected every act, every deception, every psychological cue. The distant sound of approaching officers reached the lounge, their presence confirming that the law was poised to intervene. Harriet's eyes did not leave Pritchard's. You see, every subtle sign, every misplaced object, every faint scent was a clue. Brixton's circular mark, the compass scratches, the ledger entries, the reactions of Miss Fenwick, even Eliza's observations, they all revealed the underlying orchestration. Nothing is truly hidden from a careful observer, and now the pattern has led us here, to the final confrontation. Pritchard's shoulders slumped slightly, the facade of control faltering. So, the game is over? Harriet's tone softened, though her authority remained intact. The game, as you called it, is concluded. The truth has been revealed. Justice, inevitable and measured, will follow. At that moment, the officers entered, moving swiftly to secure Pritchard. He offered no resistance, recognizing that the meticulous reconstruction of events had left him no option for escape. Miss Fenwick exhaled softly, a mixture of relief and lingering fear in her gaze, the weight of her own role finally tempered by the knowledge that the ultimate orchestrator had been apprehended. Harriet turned to the assembled guests, voice steady but reflective. This case has demonstrated that deception, manipulation, and obsessive design may appear insurmountable, yet careful observation, patience, and a clear understanding of human behavior reveal the hidden truths. Every misdirection, every staged act, every subtle psychological cue, nothing is lost to the observant mind. Eliza stepped forward, eyes wide. Miss Vale, all the clues, the compass, the lavender, the scratch marks, I never realized how they connected until you explained it. Harriet smiled faintly. Often the most crucial evidence is hidden in plain sight. The smallest inconsistencies, the tiniest deviations from natural behavior, are enough to reveal a pattern if observed with care. Even the most sophisticated orchestration leaves a trail. As the officers escorted Pritchard from the lounge, Harriet allowed herself a moment of reflection. The storm outside had cleared entirely, leaving a calm stillness over the inn. The case, which had seemed chaotic and impossible, had been unraveled through observation, deduction, and insight. The confessed villain had been revealed, the hidden mastermind apprehended, and the pattern fully exposed. Yet even as the inn settled into quiet, Harriet could not ignore the lingering tension in the air. Patterns were revealed and justice was delivered, but human ingenuity, obsession, and the capacity for manipulation remained ever present. The silent heart had yielded its secrets, yet the world beyond its walls remained filled with shadows, where clever minds might once again conspire, and where keen observation would always be the key to uncovering truth. With the case concluded, Harriet allowed herself a measured exhale, turning toward the window. The countryside lay quiet and undisturbed, yet she knew that vigilance, intellect, and insight would always be required, for deception never truly sleeps, and even the most complex patterns can be repeated elsewhere. Justice had been served, the villains apprehended, and yet the subtle, unsettling truth remained: there would always be another pattern to uncover, another mystery to unravel, and another mind to anticipate. Harriet stood at the threshold of the silent heart, the inn's doors closing softly behind the officers as they escorted Pritchard into custody. The countryside stretched out beyond the drive, mist curling over the hedgerows and reflecting the early evening light. The storm had long since passed, leaving a calm, almost deceptively serene landscape. She inhaled the crisp air, savoring the quiet, yet her mind refused to settle. The case had concluded, the villains unmasked, the patterns revealed, but even in the resolution, an unease lingered, subtle yet persistent. Every detail, every nuance had been accounted for, or so it seemed. Yet Harriet's eyes lingered on the fading path leading away from the inn. Something, a minor, almost imperceptible detail, had not entirely aligned. The note discovered in the West Wing had been a revelation, but it had also been a challenge, a cryptic message pointing to layers of orchestration beyond what even Pritchard had confessed. The handwriting, the phrasing, the subtle timing of its placement, all suggested an intelligence operating not just in shadow, but with deliberate foresight. Harriet walked slowly along the gravel path, her thoughts circling. She reviewed the case step by step: Brixton's death, the ledger's disappearance, Mr. Langley's vanishing act, Miss Fenwick's confession, and Pritchard's final revelation. Each had been meticulously traced, yet the note hinted at one more presence, one more observer or manipulator, whose hand had remained unseen. It was a shadow at the edge of her perception, the faint outline of a pattern not yet fully formed. The quiet chirping of birds and the soft rustle of leaves failed to soothe her, for her mind was alive with deduction. She replayed the guests' movements in her mind, Eliza's observations, Pritchard's calm control, Miss Fenwick's moments of subtle tension. And then a memory flickered. The lantern in the hallway, seen by Eliza last night, which had swayed gently though no wind entered the corridor. Harriet's heart quickened. It was a minor observation, easily dismissed, yet in the context of the pattern it could not be ignored. Had someone else entered the inn during the chaos? Had another intelligence been watching, perhaps guiding Pritchard, or even testing Harriet herself? The notion was unsettling, but her instincts warned her not to dismiss it. Even in triumph, she knew that true insight required vigilance. The note had been deliberate, an indirect acknowledgement that the pattern could extend further, that someone else might still be observing, shaping outcomes without revealing themselves. Harriet turned back to the inn one last time. The windows glinted in the fading light, and she imagined eyes behind the curtains, watching the events unfold, measuring reactions and assessing control. The revelation of Pritchard had been satisfying, yet the cryptic message reminded her that a case was rarely ever complete. Human intelligence, manipulation, and obsession had depths that extended beyond the immediate sequence of events. She walked toward her carriage, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound in the cooling evening. Her coat flapped softly in the wind as she allowed herself a measured exhale, eyes scanning the horizon. The case had been solved, the villains apprehended, the intricate orchestration unraveled, but the lingering presence of unanswered questions remained. The faint traces, the hidden signals, and the cryptic message suggested that the world contained mysteries yet unseen, challenges that would require her insight, patience, and unwavering attention. As she climbed into the carriage, Harriet's mind drifted back to the details that had seemed inconsequential at the time: the slight tremor in Miss Fenwick's hands, The hesitation in Pritchard's eye contact when Eliza mentioned the West Wing, the way the ledger had been slightly misaligned despite being replaced carefully. Each minor anomaly was now a seed, a potential clue, a reminder that observation never truly ended. A case might close, a villain might be apprehended, but the patterns of human behavior, deception, and ambition extended endlessly, leaving always the possibility of another thread to unravel. The coachman took the reins, and the carriage moved slowly away from the inn, gravel crunching beneath the wheels. Harriet's eyes did not leave the rear windows, watching the silent heart recede, shrouded in the soft mist. Her gaze lingered on the West Wing, where the note had been found. The shadows there seemed deeper, more deliberate, as though some intelligence still lingered, unseen and undeterred by the day's revelations. A thought came, fleeting but insistent. The final revelation of the orchestrator might have been Pritchard. But what if he too had been a pawn? The cryptic note suggested a higher hand, one that had been shaping events quietly, ensuring that both Harriet and Pritchard had been guided along a path with layers yet to be fully exposed. The notion was thrilling and unsettling at once, a subtle reminder that true mastery of a situation was rarely absolute. Harriet's lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. The case had been concluded, yet the thrill of the unseen, the intricate weaving of human ambition and deception, remained. A detective's work, she knew, was never truly finished. Even as the carriage rolled down the country lane, she felt the spark of anticipation for the next challenge, the next pattern to decipher, the next mine to anticipate. The road stretched ahead, quiet and empty, and Harriet's mind wandered over the possibilities. She thought of the faint scratches, the misaligned ledger, the cryptic note, and the subtle inconsistencies that had emerged, each a whisper of unfinished business. Somewhere beyond the horizon, someone watched, waited, and perhaps even planned anew, leaving the door open for the next challenge, the next enigma. The silent heart had surrendered its immediate secrets, but the world beyond was vast, complex, and ever full of hidden designs. As the inn receded entirely from view, Harriet settled into her seat, letting the carriage rock gently. The resolution was satisfying, the villains accounted for, yet the lingering questions remained, teasing her intellect and intuition. The mystery never truly ends, she mused, for in the realm of human behavior, deception, and intricate design, there is always one more pattern to uncover, one more subtle trace to follow, and one more challenge to test the limits of observation and deduction. Harriet Vale, detective and observer of the human mind, felt a familiar thrill. Justice had been delivered, yet the shadow of the unseen persisted, a reminder that in every solved case there lies the possibility of a new beginning, a new enigma, and a new pattern waiting for discovery. And with that thought, she leaned back, eyes scanning the road ahead, ready for whatever the next mystery might bring.